second here. Okay. Good evening and welcome to our Science Matter lecture series, which is also a part of our larger Engineering Courage Symposium in honor of Allan J. Mcdonald. My name is Kristen Intaman, and I'm a professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Science, Technology, Ethics, and Society at MSU. And before we start, I want to just perhaps, mention that you can ask a question at any time. There should be a Q&A tool that is available, or a chat tool that's available. And feel free to go ahead and submit your question at any time during the talk tonight. And we will be kind of trying to grab those and organize those, and we'll be able to ask them to Dr. Hanson after his talk. Just one thing, I ask that you address your question to all panelists, because that way, if one of us misses it, then someone else will catch it and make sure that it's asked. So just try to address any questions to all panelists. Okay, so as I mentioned, tonight's lecture is a part of our Engineering Courage Symposium honoring Allan J. Mcdonald, who, as many of you may know, was actually an MSU alum who refused to sign the launch orders before the disastrous launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. Mcdonald recently passed away this year at his home in Utah, but we really wanted to do something to honor him, because he will long be remembered for both his professional integrity in refusing to sign the launch order, but also for his courage in speaking out about what happened during the investigation of the accident. The talks throughout this symposium ask us to reflect on what it is to have courage in a professional context, and how we can cultivate that courage within ourselves, and also for those of us who teach within our students. And it's important to remember that courage is not easy, and it can require personal sacrifice and come at personal cost. It takes courage to speak up when you disagree with your colleagues or superiors or clients. It takes courage for scientists and engineers to disagree with widely accepted assumptions or new methodologies or theories. And it's that kind of spirit that is also one of the main motivations for our Science Matter lecture series. Scientists and engineers are often faced with uncertainties and trade-offs, and disagreement is necessary for transparent, critical discussion of the issues. So it also takes courage to speak up when you might be wrong. And so for all of these issues, we think this makes a great addition to our Science Matter speaker series, and a keynote for our symposium. Just before we begin, I also would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event: the College of Letters and Science, the College of Engineering, the Jake Jobs College of Business and Entrepreneurship, and the Montana Engineering Education Research Center. I also want to give a shout out to Rob Meyer. And can you all hear me? Is this frozen? Is everyone still there?
You're still going.
Okay. Okay, good. I'm getting a rainbow wheel of death, so I just want to make sure. I'm trying to unshare my screen. Okay, there we go. Sorry, this is the joy of technology, I guess. And I also want to give a special thanks to Rob Mayer, who, in addition to helping me with technical difficulties, really was the inspiration. He had the inspiration and the vision for the symposium in honor of Allan Mcdonald. Rob Mayer, for anyone who doesn't know, is a professor in our Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and he worked very tirelessly to organize all these talks. I also want to give a special thanks to both Sarah Caroli and to Stacy Nation Napper, who have provided amazing administrative assistance and pandemic problem solving. So really grateful for them. And so now it's with pleasure that I turn it over to our Dean of College of Letters and Sciences, Ives Zazera, who will be introducing our speaker this evening. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. I want to thank everyone for being here virtually and remaining flexible during this continued difficult time during the COVID pandemic. I'd also like to thank Rob Moore for the sort of work that he's been doing in stressing ethics within the university system, in particular within the engineering department. He gave a wonderful beginning talk to this two-day event. But I'd like to take this time to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. James R Hanson. Dr. Hanson is an emeritus professor of history at Auburn University in Alabama, an expert in aerospace history and the history of science and technology. He has published 14 books and numerous articles covering a wide variety of topics, including the early days of aviation, the history of aerospace engineering, NASA, the moon landings, the Space Shuttle program, and China's role in space, which continues to be growing now. Dr. Hanson's book, First Man, Simon & Schuster, is the only authorized biography of Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. The book has twice spent 3 weeks as a New York Times bestseller, garnered several major book awards, and been translated into 24 foreign languages. In 2018, First Man was turned into an Oscar-winning Hollywood film starring Ryan Gosling as Neil Armstrong, a very fine portrayal. From 1981 to 1986, he served as historian in residence at NASA Langley Research Center, from which he published a 2-volume history of Langley, Engineering in Charge, 1987, and Spaceflight Revolution, 1995, the latter of which earned a Pulitzer Prize nomination, the first and only time NASA has ever nominated a book for a Pulitzer. Dr. Hanson is also a former vice president of the path-breaking Virginia Air and Space Center. This evening, Dr. Hanson will discuss Truth, Lies, and O-Rings Inside the Space Shuttle Challenger Disaster, a powerful and award-winning book that he co-authored with Montana State University alumnus and aerospace industry legend Allan J. McDonald in 2009. I would like to just mention that I remember the Challenger incident. I remember the panels that discussed it, and at the time, as a budding physicist, I really enjoyed the types of dialogues that we were seeing as they discussed what occurred in the Challenger event. But right now, I would like to please ask you all to join me in welcoming Dr. James R. Hanson. Thank you.
Well, let me get the correct screen up for you all. There you go. Am I okay? I hope I'm okay with this. Well, thank you very much.
Looks great.
Thank you very much, Dean, for the very kind introduction. This is a very special talk for me to give because, well, it's in honor of Al McDonald, and I can't tell you. I mean, it's been very tough from when I learned of Al's death. It really was tough on me, and yeah, I had come to know him very well, and I mean, I've gotten to know lots over the course of a 40-year career now. I've gotten to know a lot of the real giants in the history of flight area, engineers and scientists and others. And Al was right there at the top of the really great people that I had gotten to know, and that included Neil Armstrong. I had just come off the Armstrong biography, and in fact, it was the Armstrong biography which encouraged Al to contact me, and I wanted to make this absolutely clear. The book, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, is Al's book. I mean, he wanted someone to assist him to perhaps check out some of the broader historical themes, and I did my best to help him. But whatever real writing I did for the book, I always tried to, I knew it was an autobiographical account. It was Al's first person account. And I always tried to make sure that it was in his voice. So I love the man. I'll never forget Alan Mcdonald, and it's terrific that you have this this symposium in his honor. Here's a famous line from U.S. space history that says, failure is not an option. And I'm sure you've all heard that phrase, failure is not an option. You know, but maybe you don't know where it comes from. Maybe you do. It came from the movie Apollo 13. And if you haven't seen the movie Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks, I strongly encourage you to see it. It's a great movie. Many consider it to be the most authentic and perhaps most truthful and accurate history film that deals with a specific true story in the American space program. The line in the movie was uttered by actor Ed Harris, who was playing a man named Gene Kranz. And Kranz was one of the flight directors at Mission Control in Houston back during the Apollo program. And in the movie, you hear him say, Kranz, you hear him say, the Mission Control is trying to figure out how to get the crippled Apollo 13 spacecraft back to Earth safely. And you hear Ed Harris say, as Gene Kranz, we've never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option. Of course, the Apollo 13 mission, took place in 1970, and so of course back then we hadn't lost anybody actually in flight, although we had lost the Apollo fire in 1967. We'd lost 3 on the launch pad. Well, later, failure is not an option became the title of an autobiographical book written by the real Gene Kranz. So you see on the cover here of his book, and the phrase became a very popular and much repeated phrase, representing the attitude that no matter how bad the situation might get, how bad things may get, that you need to stay calm, don't panic, never give up on finding a solution, and simply refuse to give in to failure. And there's a lot of good things to say about the concept of failure is not an option. I guess that's why it's become so popular, and it's used in all kinds of settings in today's world. But in truth, I'm not one of the biggest fans of this phrase. For one thing, Gene Kranz actually did not express those words. The movie makers truthfully invented the phrase for the movie, and that's been written about. The script writer gave it to the Kranz character, and I guess the rest is really history. It's become almost like it's historical fact. My bigger problem with the concept is that as nicely positive as it is to assert that failure is not an option, the truth is, in the real world of engineering and human endeavor, failures abound. They happen all the time in virtually every field. You may not want failure to be an option, and you may and should do your darndest to make sure to avoid it. But sorry, failure is ubiquitous. Failure is an elemental part of our entire human enterprise. Here you see the cover of one of my all-time favorite books. This is the book To Engineer is Human, The Role of Failure in Successful Design by Dr. Henry Petrosky, who at the time the book was published in 1985, was the head of civil engineering at Duke University. And the title of the book sort of says it all, I think. That to engineer is human, and humans are going to make mistakes. There's going to be errors. We're not perfect. But I have some quotes from the book that I think elaborate on the basic idea, and this is so important to understanding the context for something like the Challenger accident. This is from Petrosky's book, Failure is Central to Engineering. Every single calculation that an engineer makes is a failure calculation. So failure is not something the engineers ignore or pretend doesn't exist. It's central to who they are and what they study and how they approach everything. Engineering is achieving function while avoiding failure. So failure, you design to do your best to avoid failure. That's what you have to do, but it doesn't mean you're going to be perfect in terms of the result. Successful engineering is all about understanding how things break or fail. So again, it's absolutely central to engineering to understand failure and do failure analysis. The concept of failure is central to understanding engineering, for engineering design has as its first and foremost objective the obviation of failure. the avoidance of failure, or the mitigation of failure. And so when people ask me to define engineering, I say it's the enterprise by which professionals work to obviate failure. To me, I don't think there's a better way of looking at it. No body of ideas influenced me more as a young historian of technology than the words of Petrosky. I'll go back to him again. Especially the idea that the first and foremost objective of engineering was this obviation of failure. And I applied this insight that I got early in my career, back in the 1980s, really. I applied it in all of my books. I applied it in the classroom. I built a 300-level undergraduate course called Case Studies of Technological Failure, in which my students would begin by reading Petrosky. Then we would read 3 or 4 books dealing with specific technological failures. And then as a semester-long project, each student would research and write a term paper on some other specific technological failure that had occurred somewhere in the world over the past 100 or 150 years, followed by an oral presentation on the research. And of course, there was no shortage of topics for this, given, as you can see from the screen, just a handful of them, because failures and accidents were all over the place. Building failures, bridge failures, nuclear power plant accidents, catastrophic failures of all sorts. My own specialization within the history of technology was in the history of flight, and indeed accidents, failures, catastrophes checkered the history of flight as well, whether one was looking at the history of aviation or the history of space flight. One failure that my students were always very interested in studying was the disaster involving the Space Shuttle Challenger, which occurred on January 28, 1986, just a few months before I started teaching at Auburn. When it happened, and remember, this was the first time the United States had ever lost astronauts during an actual flight. As I said, we had had tragic accidents, but never that sort in flight before. I was actually working as a NASA historian on a book at NASA Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. Ironically, I was in fact at work on a chapter dealing with the early history of a rocket known as Scout. And here you see Scout. Scout was a relatively small 4-stage solid fuel rocket conceived back in the late 1950s as a simple but effective way of boosting light payloads into orbit from the NASA facility at Wallops Island off the coast of Virginia. And the problem was, as Scout entered development in the early 1960s, it kept having one failure after another. I mean, it became a joke. 4, 3, 2, 1, splash. Just one failure after another. For 4 years, just about every time that Scout launched, something bad happened, until eventually, after after more failures than NASA could count, the engineers finally got Scout to work, and to work very well indeed, and making a total of 113 successful flights and turning into one of the finest pieces of technology in the history of space exploration. But not until it had failed over and over again, and NASA had figured out why. Until then, it was a miserable failure. So what about Challenger? Okay, this is, again, I'm in my office in the archives at NASA Langley Research Center. I'm writing about all these Scout failures when at 11:39 in the morning Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, January 28, 1986, a friend came rushing into my office to tell me that the space shuttle had blown up. It was incredible. It was stunning. Nothing hit the country this hard since the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. As I said, this was the first time that we'd ever lost any of our astronauts during an actual space mission. But it had happened, and people did remember. The dean remembered where he was when the shuttle disaster happened, and certainly I do too, and anyone who was living at the time that was old enough to have, to pay any attention. And it happened right before our eyes, right on our televisions. We saw the whole awful thing. Not only were 7 astronauts on board, but one of those 7 was payload specialist Krista McAuliffe, who would have been the first teacher in space. Media, in part because of the Teacher in Space program, media coverage of the accident was nonstop and was very sensational. One study later reported that 90% of Americans had heard the news of the Challenger accident within an hour of the accident. And over the next several days, we would see Challenger, which was STS-51L. We saw Challenger explode into pieces multiple times as TV kept repeating the launch to explosion footage over and over again. Well, of course, as a NASA historian, I followed the story very closely, especially after President Ronald Reagan established a special presidential commission to investigate the disaster, a commission of 14 members led by former Secretary of State William Rogers, whose hearings were covered live on radio and television almost in their entirety for the next several weeks until the panel released its findings in June of 1986. Books on the Challenger accident soon, in fact, I would say too soon, really too soon, came out. Challenger, A Major Malfunction by a young journalist, Malcolm McConnell, which came out in the spring of 1987, and Prescription for Disaster, which was written by another journalist, Joseph J. Trento, which also came out in 1987. So it just took a year to get these books out. If you read the bibliographical essay that I wrote for the end of Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, you can see what I thought about these two books. Essentially, they were journalistic exposés that were pretty deficient in lasting value because they lacked the dispassion and informed technical and programmatic analysis that was really needed to understand something as complicated as why the shuttle had this accident. The next book that came out on the Challenger accident came in 1996, and it was much more substantial, entitled The Challenger Launch Decision, Risky Technology, Culture, and Deviance at NASA. Its author, Dr. Diane Vaughan, was a professor of sociology at Boston College. And what her book argued in a nutshell was that the roots of the Challenger disaster were to be found in the very nature of modern institutional life. Vaughan built a case around her notion that all organizations develop cultural beliefs that shape their actions and outcomes, and not all of those outcomes are for the good. In Vaughan's view, NASA during the 1970s and the 1980s and the post-Apollo period, when the shuttle program was defined, turned into an organization whose dominant underlying psychology was that it was in a very tough place institutionally because it was competing for very scarce government resources for enough money to do business. And this special sense of budgetary challenge fostered, according to Vaughan, an organizational culture in NASA that accepted taking big risks and cutting corners as norms. And there was the sociologist terms as norms, or at what was normal. And so Vaughan concluded that it wasn't any political pressure, it wasn't a conspiracy of any sort, or it wasn't even incompetence that led to the Challenger accident, which is what McConnell and Trento, those books, had essentially put forward in the year after Challenger. Rather, according to Vaughan, it was a long series of small and seemingly harmless modifications to technical and procedural standards that infected NASA over the course of several years. No specific rules have been broken in the Challenger decision, according to Vaughan, not at NASA or by any of its contractors. Instead, the fault lay in the cumulative weight of mundane organizational norms and groupthink dynamics. That was a key phrase in her analysis, that this was groupthink that ultimately made NASA and its chief shuttle contractors, like the one Alan McDonald worked for, Morton Thakal, vulnerable to making some very bad decisions, like launching Challenger that particular January morning. Well, a lot of people found Vaughan's analysis compelling. The whole idea of some level of deviant behavior becoming normalized under pressure inside of an organization. And for many people, Vaughan's book became almost the Bible on what caused the Challenger accident. And even something NASA itself came to accept kind of as the party line. Because what Vaughan's analysis suggested was that no one in particular, certainly no specific individuals, were personally responsible for the accident. What was at fault was that something had gone wrong inside the organizational culture as a whole. Well, there are other Challenger books I could talk about, but I need to move on to the book that Alan wrote and that I helped him with, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, which was published in 2009. Normally, I spend quite a bit of time talking about who was Alan McDonald, and I do want to say a few things about this, but being the audience here is at Montana State University, and of course Al was a graduate, so you already know a little bit about him, but I still want to say a few things about him. He was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1937, the youngest of 4 children. His family eventually moved to Bozeman, Montana, where he spent most of his childhood. Attending Montana State, he received an associate degree in engineering in 1957, and that's significant because that's the same year that the Russian satellite Sputnik gave birth to the space age and really propelled a lot of young men and women into thinking about careers in science and engineering and in space specifically. Then he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering in 1959. Out of school, he got a job with a Utah company called Morton Thiokol, where he worked on the first stage of the Minuteman ballistic missile military system. When the space shuttle program started in the 1970s, he was still at Morton Thiokol, and he got assigned to be one of Thiokol's chief engineers for the design of the solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, that were going to be used to help launch the shuttle. And at the time of the Challenger accident, his formal title at Thiokol was Director of the Space Shuttle Solid Rocket Motor Program. So that's a very quick, he deserves a much longer setup than that, but that's what we have for him right tonight. On the fateful day that STS-51L lifted off, Al McDonald was at work in the launch control room at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The night before, he had received a telephone call from a fellow who worked for him, reporting that a weather forecaster in Orlando was forecasting a cold front coming into the Cape that could drop temperatures to as low as 18 degrees Fahrenheit by the next morning. That's extremely cold for Florida. And that was not good news for the launch of a shuttle. As Thiokol's director of solid rocket motors and the company's primary representative at the Cape, Allan Mcdonald was responsible for everything about the operation of those SRBs that were strapped to the side of the shuttle. And Allan well knew, based on NASA and Thiokol data, that the rubber O-ring seals that sealed the field joints at the various segments of the solid rocket boosters would not operate properly at such low temperatures. They would grow hard, they would get hard, they would grow rigid, and they would not make a properly tight seal. So Al got on the phone and made 3 phone calls that night. First, he made to meteorologists at the Cape to learn whether they really were projecting on an hour-by-hour basis all through that night and into the next morning. The second call he made was to his engineers in Utah, asking them to calculate what the actual temperatures would be on the various parts of their SRBs at the time the launch window opened for Challenger the next morning. More than that, he told the engineers back in Utah to make an assessment of their concerns about cold temperatures and how they would affect the sealing of those O-rings. And he wanted them to make a recommendation as soon as possible on the lowest temperature the SRBs could tolerate at time of launch and still do their job safely. As Al told the guys back at Thiokol in Utah, I want that recommendation and decision made by the vice president of engineering and not by project management. In other words, he wanted the head of engineering at Thiokol to have a conclusion about that data. And they had been testing about the effects of temperature and cold ring. It wasn't like they had never thought of this before. There had been lots of testing about it. Al wanted that analysis from engineering because he felt the O-ring performance in cold weather was a pretty thorny technical issue. It wasn't simple to figure out, and it should be decided on its technical merits, not by corporate management. That's a key point about this. Alan's third call was to his company's representative at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. You know, the responsibilities for the shuttle program were basically shared between Huntsville and Houston, and then of course Washington D.C., where the NASA headquarters was at. But the people in Huntsville in particular had serious oversight responsibilities and dealings with the SRB folks, Thiokol. And so Al made that call to to the Thiokol rep at NASA Marshall, and in that call, Al asked for a teleconference to take place that same evening. A three-way conversation between the Thiokol engineers in Utah, the NASA guys in charge of the shuttle at Huntsville, and the Thiokol reps at Kennedy Space Center. This teleconference is crucial understanding what went wrong, really. That three-way teleconference quickly got arranged. And in that teleconference, Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering, a man named Bob Lund, recommended to NASA that the shuttle not be launched below 53 degrees Fahrenheit because data from testing and from analysis of the condition of the O-rings on the recovered boosters from the previous space shuttles. You know, the way this worked is the solid rockets got them up to a certain height, and the orbiter took off with its main engine, and the solid rocket boosters dropped down. They recovered them from the ocean, brought them back, and refabbed them and refilled them with their propellant, and so they could see how the SRBs had done, and that's what Al wanted to know. What was the condition of the O-rings? Did any of them show any defects or dangers, or how did they wear through the launch? And what it really did show pretty clearly is that the O-rings were not going to perform very well. I mean, that was the engineering conclusion. That not that they'd ever launched that cold of a temperature before, but at the temperature that they had launched was the coldest it had ever been, was like 53 degrees ambient temperature, was that the O-rings probably weren't going to do very well if they got much lower than that. So that was that must be 53 degrees minimum at launch. Well, the NASA guys in Huntsville that were on that teleconference, the NASA guys now, okay, so you got Thiokol guys in Utah, and you got Allan down in Florida, and you've got the NASA guys in Alabama. Well, they didn't like that conclusion that they were going to have to wait till it got to be 53 degrees. They didn't believe that the data about the O-rings was all that conclusive. As I said, the data was kind of thorny, you know, and there wasn't an absolute consensus on things, but these guys were the experts, and the Thiokol experts, they were the ones that designed and checked out the SRBs most closely. And if they're saying 53 degrees, you know, one could say, well, why didn't NASA accept that? But they didn't believe the data from their own analysis was all that conclusive, and they wanted Thiokol to show them something more definitive before they would accept the launch commitment criteria. That's the phrase, the launch commitment criteria, that they felt it should be changed. I mean, if Thiokol is saying 53 degrees, well, we don't like that. That launch criteria is too tough for us to meet. The top shuttle guy at Marshall, a guy named Larry Malloy, in fact, has expressed during the teleconference, expressed his frustration at one point, shouting over the phone, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April? The eve of a launch is a hell of a time to be generating new launch commit criteria." So that was NASA's point of view. You know, you're hitting us now with this 53-degree thing. We hadn't worked with that before. We knew, you know, your data, we just are questioning your data and the conclusions you're making from the data. Well, at this point in time, a man named Joe Kilminster, who was vice president of the Space Booster Program at Thiokol, in a sense, Alan Mcdonald's boss, came on the telecom, and he asked for a 5-minute offline caucus. He didn't want to be connected by phone with the NASA guys in Marshall anymore for a while. He wanted to caucus, just talk to his own guys. 5 minutes, he said, just 5 minutes. And he told NASA he wanted to make sure that Thiokol was presenting everything that it had available to them, and to see if they could better analyze and determine whether there was a lower temperature that was safe to launch. That caucus was supposed to last 5 minutes. It lasted over 30 minutes. And of course, what about Al McDonald? Al's in Florida, so he didn't hear what was going on in Utah inside his company during that half hour. But he was surprised when the teleconference resumed, and on came Joe Kilminster telling NASA that the Thiokol engineers had taken another hard look at all their data and concluded that it was okay after all to proceed with the launch as planned. No restrictions at all, no temperature requirement whatsoever. NASA's reaction in Alabama was, well, that's good. That's a recommendation we accept. They accepted that abrupt change of mind without questioning. Like, well, how did you change your mind? What data made you change your mind? Didn't ask. Apparently they got the answer they wanted, but they wanted more. Larry Malloy told Joe Kilminster that NASA needed that recommendation put in writing and signed by a responsible THIACOL official. That hadn't been asked for before. Back in Florida, with his mouth open, Alan Mcdonald knew who was responsible, knew that the responsible THIACOL official to give that written launch recommendation, to hand that over to NASA, was going to have to be him. It was him. That's why he was there at the Cape. And Al made what he came to feel was the smartest decision he ever made in his life. He refused to do it. He refused to sign it. For Al, a major ethical violation was occurring. It wasn't that he thought it was unethical that the NASA people questioned THIACOL, how THIACOL arrived at their original launch decision. What was unethical, in Al's view, was that the NASA officials knew that the obligation of the THIACOL staff was to prove that it was safe to launch the shuttle. That was what THIACOL had always been asked to do. The contractor was asked, prove to us that it's safe. It's safe to launch. That's the recommendation. It's safe. But here was NASA putting THIACOL and the THIACOL engineers in the position where they had to prove that the shuttle SRBs would fail. It wasn't that they were saying, prove that it's going to work. Prove to us that it's not going to work. That's what they basically said. And that's a totally different question. You're never supposed to do that, as Al makes clear in our book. In fact, the final decision inside THIACOL, which Mcdonald didn't know at the time, he only found out later, was that Joe Kilminster's own boss, a man named Cal Wiggins, who was vice president and general manager of the company, had taken over the meeting in Utah during that offline caucus and had decided not that the technical judgment of his engineers was the way to go, but instead recommend going ahead with the morning launch. At one point he said to them, I want you to take off your engineers' hats and put on your management hats. Look at it from our point of view. Well, that was really not something that they should have asked his engineers to do. Al, as we wrote in Truth Lies in O-Rings, you can see the phrase, Al said it was a classic case where good technical judgment and common sense seem to have yielded to the philosophy that the customer is always right, the customer being NASA. As I said, Al was so disturbed by his company's change to a launch, to go ahead, give him NASA the green light, giving them a launch recommendation, which you see here, that he refused to sign the launch recommendation. He didn't understand it. He didn't feel good about it. He didn't know how it had changed from engineers to management decision. So he forced his boss in Utah, Joe Kilminster, to sign it and fax it to him. He wasn't going to do it himself. He had to wait for the fax, that he had to do. And while waiting for the fax to arrive in Florida, Al turned to the NASA people at the Cape with whom he worked, and he said, I don't really feel comfortable with this decision. I don't agree with it. But more importantly, you yourselves can't accept that recommendation either. And they responded, well, what do you mean by that, Al? We're talking about other contractors like Boeing who built the orbiter. They also had to give the green light and all that. So there was other people that had the payload company whoever had built the payload, they had to give their sign off. So Al talked to them and said, you guys shouldn't accept this launch recommendation either. And they asked, well, what do you mean by that, Al? And he said, well, you cannot accept it because you know, and I know, that you are asking us to fly those boosters outside a temperature that it has been qualified to fly. And you can't do that. You can't fly any of the shuttle hardware outside of its qualification limits. That's against protocol. So you can't accept it. I'm against launching not based on what I know, but because of what I do not know. And you are in exactly the same position, he told them. It's just not worth taking the risk with all these unknowns. But Al, these shouldn't be your concerns, they told him. You shouldn't really concern yourselves with them. But we'll pass them on to our bosses in an advisory kind of way. Well, the story now moves on to the fateful morning of the launch itself. Waking up early, Al remembers hearing on the radio that the temperature was 22 degrees. Arriving at the Launch Control Center and sitting down at the console where he monitored all the data on the solid rocket boosters, he could see a large TV screen that there was quite a bit of ice hanging on the shuttle, sitting there on the launch pad. And he quickly concluded for himself, well, there's no way that they're going to launch this thing today with all that ice. A few minutes later, he saw an ice team dispatched to the launch platform to knock down as much of the ice as possible, not just on Challenger, but on the launch platform itself. And then less than an hour after that, the ice team was sent out again. And when it got back after taking off even more ice, the ice team reported that they thought it would be okay to proceed with the launch from the point of view of the ice on the launcher. In truth, what Al expected in terms of he kind of sensed that a catastrophe could easily be coming, but what he wasn't really looking that much yet at an O-ring failure because of cold temperature. He was certainly aware of it, but he thought that the problem most likely would be that the shuttle would fail right at the instant of ignition, right as the solid rocket boosters lit. But as we know, the catastrophe did not manifest until 73 seconds later. To be precise, the breakup of the vehicle began at T plus 73.162 seconds at an altitude of 48,000 feet. In the launch control room, Al Mcdonald could hear many people actually sobbing in the background. They all knew what had just happened, and they knew that it was evidently clear from the start that this was not going to be a survivable incident. Now, the day after Challenger, Al flew to Huntsville to be part of the failure analysis team. Neither he nor anyone else at this point knew that the failure of an O-ring was the cause of the tragedy. In fact, he was just about convinced that the accident was caused by a cracked turbine blade in the Space Shuttle main engine. That had always been the biggest concern about the shuttle system. The turbopumps in the three main liquid fuel engines churning away as they did at 35,000 RPM, their thin wall combustion chambers burning vast quantities of high energy hydrogen at 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hydrogen that seconds before had been stored as a liquid at minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was always considered to be the difficult thing in the daisy chain of the shuttle system, that the main engines on the orbiter would be the problem. And that's what Al Mcdonald and many others thought at first had to be the source of the failure, that one of these blades had cracked, came loose, went flying into the external tank, resulting in kind of a chain reaction, infecting the SRBs and having a catastrophic disaster. But as engineers certainly know, facts murder theory. Historians know that too. And a few days after Al arrived in Huntsville, the worst fear for Thiokol came home to roost when word arrived from NASA guys down at the Cape who were looking at films of the launch that the movie showed some fire coming out of the aft side of the right SRB just before the explosion. You can see the arrow here pointing at it in these slides. And when Al heard that, and soon he saw the films for himself, he knew that that meant that the accident probably did happen exactly for the reason that he and the Thiokol engineers had been concerned about the night before the launch, that the darn O-rings were too cold to perform their function. It wasn't until President Reagan decided to form a presidential commission that the real answers came out. And they certainly did not come out initially or very willingly from NASA. And that's another very sad part of the story. Over the next weeks, it became frustratingly clear to McDonald that NASA officials really didn't want to hear about cold O-rings or anything about how Thiokol had, at the last minute, changed its recommendation from red to green based on what NASA was resisting in that teleconference the night before. But things soon got very hairy when the Presidential Commission started investigating. A story got into the press in the New York Times that one of NASA's budget analysis guys had sent NASA headquarters a memo several months back expressing concern about all the problems that the space shuttles were having with their O-rings and the field joints, and how much money the problems might take to get fixed. So this was a budget analyst. It wasn't even an engineer, but he was seeing lots of, we need more money for more testing, and we need to get more data on the SRBs. And so he let the New York Times know about this, and it became a story that sparked a lot of concern on the Presidential Commission, because NASA officials so far had not breathed a word to the commissioners about any of this, even though almost a week earlier, McDonald had briefed NASA itself on exactly what had caused the accident on the cold O-rings. And so the people that from NASA going to talk to the Rogers Commission, they weren't breathing a word of this yet. Concerned that it was possibly hearing more about the cause of the accident from the New York Times than it was from NASA, the Rogers Commission scheduled a closed hearing in which NASA was to make a comprehensive briefing. The person NASA chose to give the briefing was none other than Larry Malloy, the Huntsville shuttle officials who had complained to Thiokol in that ill-fated teleconference that it wanted him to wait. What do you want me to wait until next April to launch? So it was ironic and not so good in retrospect that this was the guy that NASA was having talk to the commission. Ironically, virtually all of the charts that Malloy showed in his briefing in this closed door session came from Al McDonald, who in the past couple of weeks had given long reports to NASA headquarters about the O-rings as the clearest cause of the accident. Well, this is a very dramatic moment, and in documentaries and any films that are ever done on Challenger, this will be a major moment in which Al McDonald will star. Al McDonald attended this closed meeting, which was held in the old executive office building next to the White House. He sat in the very back of the room because Malloy and the other NASA officials on the agenda had made it very clear to McDonald and to Thiokol that the NASA folks, were going to be giving the entire briefing. No one else was needed to make any comments unless they were specifically requested to do so. So Al was able to go, but he had to sit in the back, and Malloy didn't expect him to speak up unless Malloy asked him a specific question. The entire morning was taken up by Malloy's presentation using Al's charts, and Malloy briefed the commission for nearly 2 hours until the commission stopped for lunch. And when lunch was over, returning from lunch, Dr. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space who was one of the Rogers commissioners, sat down and started summing through a bunch of pink slips containing telephone messages that she had apparently got that morning before the break. And as the session was about to resume for the afternoon, Dr. Ride spoke up and said to Larry Malloy, "Before we get back to your briefing, I'd like to ask you a few questions. During the break, I returned a few of my phone calls, and one of them was from a reporter here in Washington who told me he had heard a rumor that one of the shuttle contractors may have been concerned before the launch about the cold temperatures affecting the shuttle hardware and maybe even recommended not launching. Is that true, Mr. Malloy?" Well, Malloy paused, then answered, "Well, yes, we did have a teleconference with Morton Thiokol's concerns about the projected temperatures on the field joints and O-rings. That was honest." I mean, that's my statement. That was honest. But Malloy then went on to say, quote, "But after hearing all of the discussion, we all concluded that there was no problem with the predicted temperatures for the solid rocket motors, and I received a document from the solid rocket motor project management at Thiokol to that effect, that there was no adverse consequence expected due to the temperature on the night of the 27th. Well, up to this point, or by this point, I should say, as you can imagine, Al McDonald was doing not a slow burn anymore. He was doing a fast burn. He's sitting in the back of the room thinking to himself, well, I guess that's a true statement, but that is about as misleading as anything I have ever heard. and it is certainly unethical for Malloy to be saying this. So what did Al do? You heard Kristen talking about courage. Al started walking from the back of the room down the stairs toward the conference table where the Presidential Commission was sitting. There's Rogers, former Secretary Rogers in the middle, Sally Ride to his left, Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, who was the vice chair of the commission, sitting right to Rogers' right hand. And so he walks down, Al's walking down, and what does Larry Malloy do? Well, he's in a pretty tight spot, obviously. He sees McDonald coming forward, and perhaps optimistically, Mr. Malloy surmised that Al was coming down to give him a hand, to help him out, to help explain the view graphs that he was, this was back in the day before PowerPoint and you use these transparent view graphs. What in fact Malloy said, recovering, was, "Mr. Chairman, Alan Mcdonald from Morton Thiokol wants to make a point." You bet your sweet behind he did. In a nutshell, what Al said was, quote, "I think this commission should know that Morton Thiokol was so concerned about the projected cold temperatures on our field joints and O-rings that our original recommendation based on our data was not to launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit." Well, it was like a bomb had gone off in the room. "Who the hell are you?" Chairman Rogers said to Alan. "I'm the director of the solid rocket motor program at Morton Thiokol." To which Rogers replied, "Would you please come down here and repeat what you've just said? Because if I just heard what I think I heard, then this may be in litigation for years to come." Well, at that moment, Alan McDonald's life changed forever, because he knew who was going to be in the middle of all this litigation for years to come: him. And from that day on, Alan McDonald decided he better write down everything he knew in as much detail as he could remember, everything he heard and everything that was published in the press about the shuttle and about the boosters and about the O-rings, because he knew he was going to have to answer and explain a lot of stuff. And he did that for the next several years. Well, in June 1986, some 17 weeks after the tragedy, the Rogers Commission issued its report to the president. And what it reported was that the Challenger accident was caused by a failure in the O-ring sealing in the aft field joint on the right solid rocket booster, causing pressurized hot gases to flame and eventually blow by the O-ring seal, and from there contact the adjacent external tank, causing major structural failure. The failure of the O-rings was attributed to a design flaw, as their performance could be too easily compromised by factors including the low temperature on the day of the launch. It was a conclusion that Al agreed with completely, that the O-rings were there. But at the same time, I remember talking to Alan about it. I mean, in a sense, nothing was really wrong with the original design of the O-ring seal, if the shuttle had not been operated outside of the conditions that had been laid out for the system. It would have worked if it had not had a problem, if it had just operated only the temperatures that had been tested for. Well, Al's story was hardly over. After his first full testimony to the commission, which he did do, he was called in by Thiokol management, and he was told that he was no longer the head of the solid rocket motor program. Now he was the head of scheduling. You heard it. They took him away from heading up the SRB program, and they put him in charge of scheduling. Scheduling, Al asked. What in the hell are you going to schedule? We're not going to build anything for a while. What we build is certainly not going to be what we've been building. So the Thiokol company took all of his engineers away from Al, and they gave him this, what he considered kind of a non-job. Furthermore, the Thiokol management told him, "Oh, you are also off the failure team. You can't have any interaction with NASA. You can't do any more of the failure analysis." So Al basically was put into purgatory. He was put into purgatory because he had the courage and the ethical backbone to tell the truth on his bosses and on the NASA people. Purgatory didn't last all that long. as it turned out. One of the other members, one of the leading members of the Presidential Commission was this man, Air Force General Donald Kutina. And Kutina saw Al at a meeting of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in Washington, D.C. later that year, after Al had been put on ice by Martin Thakal. And Kutina asked Al, what the hell are you doing here at this AIAA meeting? You need to spend all your time figuring out why the shuttle failed the way that it did. To which Al said, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I haven't been doing that for some time. What do you mean you aren't doing that anymore? Kutina asked him. Well, I was on the failure team, but I got removed from it. Well, when did you get removed from it? Right after I testified to you guys. Well, that's, pardon my language, that's bullshit. I remember interviewing Kutina. He could be a pretty direct man. That's how generals talk, I suppose. Well, we'll soon fix that problem, he said to Al. I mean, he wasn't going to take them putting Al on ice and being penalized for being brave enough to tell the truth to the commission. Al later learned that Kutina called the chairman of Morton Thakal and had him bring in all of his top corporate executives to listen to what Kutina had to say to him. And the good general basically read them the riot act. And the next thing that Al heard from his boss is what he was not only being taken off of scheduling, he was going to be the head of the whole redesign team for fixing the problem on the shuttle. So Al took charge of the redesign team that was to fix the solid rocket boosters, which was a very high priority task that involved both Thakal and NASA engineers and managers, a task that was very high priority because it was critically important to the country's space programs, both civilian and military, to get the shuttle back flying safely as soon as possible. And I think I should say, for those of you who don't know, when the shuttle program came along in the 80s and 70s and 80s and was being defined, it was being defined as, not an experimental vehicle, but as something that was going to be an operational truck, that was going to be mostly reusable. And that the plan was you're going to be able to turn around shuttles, orbiters, every 2 weeks. You have a launch every 2 weeks. Well, that was totally unrealistic. But kind of all of the eggs of the American booster program was being put in one basket. The shuttle was going to take over everybody's job. You weren't going to need, this rocket. You weren't going to need that rocket. It would also serve the military, not just the civilian program. So you had to get the shuttle going again, and then you also had to. One thing Challenger also showed you is you better start working on some other boosters besides the shuttle, because we can't just be relying on one vehicle to get us up there. Well, Allan did a great job as head of that solid rocket motor redesign team. His task force did a superb job. It did so under great scrutiny, including serious scrutiny from the National Research Council and from the National Academy of Engineering. It wasn't just NASA. And by the time the task force finished its work, the SRBs were, in the opinion of most folks that were closely associated with the shuttle, the safest piece of equipment on the shuttle. And from the time the shuttle flights resumed with the launch of Discovery in 1988 to the very last shuttle flight by Atlantis in July 2011, all of the flown SRBs came back pristine. They were all in great shape, involving some 110 launches. So the redesign it's kind of like the story I told you of Scout, that it took some failures, but then when it got figured out, it had a just outstanding record, and Al deserves a lot of credit. Of course, there would be one more catastrophic failure to talk about, and I think I need to mention it, which was the demise of the Space Shuttle STS-107 Columbia on February 1st, 2003. After all the lessons learned from Challenger, one might have thought that something like this couldn't happen again, even 17 years later. After what happened, in a nutshell, after Columbia launched, NASA clearly saw on film that a large piece of protective foam insulation had broken off the shuttle's fuel tank during launch, impacted the orbiter, and damaged the thermal protection system on the leading edge of the orbiter's left wing. During re-entry from space, as we know, that damaged wing slowly overheated and came apart, eventually leading to loss of control, disintegration of the vehicle, and the death of the entire crew. But Al knew the inside story of this, and we had some interesting conversations about this. NASA and its contractor on the orbiter, which was Boeing, had run some pretty fancy analysis using a Cray supercomputer on what the impact damage could be from things like from debris like this. And using this most up-to-date computer model that was available at the time, NASA and Boeing together concluded that the damage couldn't be significant enough to prevent an orbiter from returning home safely from space. Well, that proved wrong. And another inside story of this was there was a group of research engineers at NASA Langley, where a lot of aerodynamics and material structures guys had years and years of experience, that were not comfortable with the conclusion that that debris couldn't cause significant damage. In fact, they proposed, well, let's find out about how bad it is. You know, there's other satellites up in Earth orbit, some of the military. So why don't we have NASA ask the Department of Defense to turn one of its spy satellites toward the Columbia while it's still orbiting, and we'll be able to see if the damage is significant enough that it could cause catastrophe upon reentry. And they those Langley engineers made a specific request to the NASA mission management team to have the DoD do that, but the request was turned down by, I think it was actually by management in Houston, the mission management team, on the basis that the analysis from the supercomputer was pretty definitive and it didn't need to go through all the protocol to make the request to the DoD. So it never asked the DoD to do it. Al considered that this is a direct quote, a very serious mistake. And he said the most unethical non-act, something you didn't do in NASA history, showed a change in the NASA culture from the can-do attitude of the early space program to one that sort of said we can't do that. We don't want to ask the DoD to do that. We don't need to do that. Boeing's happy with the supercomputer analysis. Well, let me wrap some things up with some final thoughts on Challenger, on engineering ethics, and on technological failure. The biggest breach of ethics in Challenger, in my view, and I think in Alan Mcdonald's view, was that both Thiokol and NASA attempted to cover up what really happened the night before the launch of that teleconference. There was definite obfuscation by NASA on what really caused the accident until it was impossible to obfuscate any longer. They finally had to live up to it. It's one thing to make a mistake in deciding to launch Challenger while ostensibly pressuring the maker of the SRB, Thiokol, to change its launch recommendation, but it's a more terrible breach when people in high places with time to think about it continue to deceive and cover up. And that sort of thing really bothered Al. Looking back at all the decisions and things that happened, I would suggest that there are 4 levels of ethical breaches to discuss with Challenger. And in one way or another, I talked about these with Al, although he never put them quite in this way. There is a level 1 ethics violation associated with having to make difficult decisions with tough pressure time constraints in a very stressful environment, and then making a bad decision or making a decision on a bad reason. So, that's kind of a level 1, a lower level ethical violation. Worse yet, there's a level 2, which involves individuals who know that the dangers exist yet don't say anything. And this is a more serious breach of professional ethics, this silence, which sometimes turns into the biggest obstacle to overcome in any decision making that involves risk. And still worse, there's a more severe breach of ethics occurs, 3rd level, when those who believe that an accident may be more likely than not, and more likely than their organization is willing to admit, but nonetheless support the decision to proceed because they recognize that it's what their bosses want them to do, and they can benefit by supporting their bosses. That's a much more serious breach. And we don't know, I mean, boy, if we had an absolute record of what was said at Thiokol during that teleconference in the 30-minute closed caucus, to know what was being said, where the people fall in these different levels of ethical concerns. Finally, the very worst breach of ethics, level 4, occurs with those who participate in a cover-up, blaming others or intentionally distorting the facts to avoid blame. And Al thought this was far worse because if the cover-up is successful, it could lead to another accident in the future for the very same technical reason or unethical decision-making process that should have been corrected. And finally, I need to say that there absolutely can be accidents that are totally independent of ethical violations at any level, and Al certainly knew that. There are many, many instances where technological failures or accidents result from the purest definition of an accident. It's not expected, it's not foreseen, it's not intended. Indeed, accidents and failures appear to be inevitable in the wake of prolonged success. You know, that's what happened with NASA when you got things that were working and working and working and working, and you think, well, it's going to work again. It's going to work, even though we know there's some issues. Yeah, it's been working, so it's going to work again. So you sort of become a victim of your own success, which the problem which becomes it encourages lower margins of safety, and it certainly promotes overconfidence in what you're doing. And it is at this point of overconfidence and lowering your margins of safety when many failures do occur, which in turn leads to a breaking of confidence, to a new rigor in scrutiny, to greater safety margins, and hence to new periods of success. So you could say that this is sort of a cyclical thing, but gosh, it'd be nice to break the cycle. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there will always be failures and disasters as engineers and designers push the boundaries for building taller buildings, longer bridges, reaching farther into space. Each time there is a failure or disaster, changes are made and regulations introduced only to be outstripped by further developments. Even if you are not involved directly as an engineer or manager, you as a member of society are certain to be affected by technological disasters and catastrophic failures over the course of your lifetime. Understanding why they happen and how ethical breaches might be involved and how they can perhaps be better handled by society when they do occur is of vital importance to the health and vitality of our modern world. So I close with a final statement from Henry Petrosky. It is not that success stories cannot serve as models for good design or as exemplars of creative engineering. They can do that, but they cannot teach us how close to failure they are. So Petrosky felt, Al felt, I certainly have come to feel that it's important to really focus in on the failures and failure analysis to see what all's happened with them. Not that you can't learn from success. You can learn from success, but boy, you better not ignore failure in the picture. It's probably more important in the end. And I usually close with the Petrosky quote, but given this is Al's night, I do think Al would really want to talk to the young people, if there are young people listening tonight, and I certainly hope they are. I think he would, the word that was used by Kristen to begin with, courage. I mean, Al really had courage. He had lots of regrets too, because he wasn't able to change the outcome, and he second guessed himself, as did lots of people that work for Thiokol. There was a man named Roger Beaujolais who was another O-ring expert, and Roger was in on that teleconference, and he never forgave himself and actually had thoughts of suicide for the rest of his life. He went through serious depressions. So there are personal consequences to what you do, courage or not having courage. And I think Al would want you to be, if you go into engineering in particular, you're going to be part of an organization, a bureaucracy, a company. And a lot of these companies are going to be profit motivated, and they're going to want to keep their customers happy. And if you're an engineer and you understand that there's things going on that management, you shouldn't take your engineer's hat off if they ask you to, you might want to do it just as a thought experiment. But in the end, you better maybe keep your engineer's hat on if your managers are trying to, do something that is not a good decision. So you've got to be prepared to speak up. And also another thing Al would talk about is, the Boeing and NASA reliance on the Cray supercomputer and the data on what debris could do to a shuttle. Computers are terrific, and we don't want to live without them anymore. But Al, I think, would say to you, don't be over reliant on them. If your gut tells you something else, if you've been doing some back of the envelope calculations, there's good engineering to be done that doesn't involve computers. And if you have a contrary opinion, you might be the one that can save the situation. And sometimes, and I think Kristen brought this up, sometimes it's just one guy. Maybe it's one person, a man or a woman. Maybe it's the one person who really has the best answer. And if you feel you've got the best answer, you might be risking a career, you might be risking a promotion, but what the guys at Falcon felt they risked was the lives of 7 astronauts, you know, and they felt a great responsibility for that. So remember Al's story. Remember Al Mcdonald. He was a terrific engineer. He was an even better human being, and he had his career will always stand as a model of, I think, heroism and bravery and sticking up for what's right. So thank you very much, and I hope you have some questions for me.
This is where you would hear thunderous applause
Thunderous
in a
applause.
normal situation. Thank you so much for a really inspiring talk. So feel free, I want to take this moment to remind attendees that you can post questions in the Q&A. I know we have a couple. Rob, would you like to start and have the honor of the first question?
Well, I would be delighted, of course. Jim, thanks so much for your words. You're doing great honor to Alan Mcdonald, the person we're memorializing in this symposium. So thank you so much for all of that. It's really, really terrific.
Al, I'm going to get a picture of Al up here again.
Thank you. You mentioned Roger Beaujolais, and
Yeah.
he actually came and spoke at Montana State University back in 2002 or 2003, I think it was. And so that was more than 15 years after the accident. And during his presentation for the students here, he could not get through his presentation without breaking down. And so after all those years, it still affected him to a great extent. Now, Alan Mcdonald did not quite have the same effect on him. And I think one of the explanations might be the fact that he was able to do something afterwards. He was involved in the redesign and so forth, and he was very proud of that. Is that, do you agree with that? Do you think that the catharsis was part of that?
I think it was. I mean, although, and I not only spoke with Beaujolais at some length, but he also came to Auburn University and gave a talk. So I saw similar things to you. I have, in talking with Al, I certainly saw, I mean, Al could be very stoic and he was very controlled, I think, in public settings, but I saw him with tears in his eyes more than once talking about this too. But I do think what he did in terms of keeping the fact that he was able to go back and help and be leading the redesign of the SRBs, and also again that he was taking, I mean, when he brought me in on the book project, he had 2,500 pages of book to deal with. I mean, there wasn't anything that escaped his attention, and I think that was a cathartic outlet for him, that he saw this role of telling the story, the inside story as he knew it, and I think that gave him an outlet for his feelings about it. I do think that I mean, he was very proud of what he did do, and I mean, and he did not take that launch recommendation. He did not sign that launch recommendation, and then he did step up in front of the Rogers Commission when he was not being asked to do that. That was, I mean, can you imagine being in that setting? We've probably all been in some social settings where you'd like to say something, but you think, oh, I mean, that was high drama for Al Mcdonald to do that. And I think he was proud of that bravery, but I don't think he didn't see it as brave necessarily. He saw it as just what he had to do. I mean, somebody had to speak up and tell the truth about this. I'm not sure. It also, I think, when in comparing Beaujolais and Al, I think you'd have to look at each one of them biographically, and just, I mean, people's emotional makeup are just different, and so I'm not. That's not the comment on Rogers, but Roger was very bothered that he didn't do more that specific night. He knew what had happened in the teleconference. Al didn't know about it till later, what had happened, and so Roger told people and told me that in retrospect, he wishes that he would have gone way above his bosses. In fact, he told me he should have called the White House and told the White House, which was paying a lot of attention to the launch, especially because of the Teacher in Space program. President Reagan was going to give a State of the Union address the night of February 1st, and so Beaujolais thought, I should have done more. There's something I should have done that I didn't do, because I knew what had gone on in that teleconference. I mean, not that Al didn't think there was more that he could do, but he knew that he did what he could, given the circumstances that he was in, which was not knowing what had gone on in that darn teleconference.
So I have another question. This one is from Sarah Shannon. And she notes that, courage is a virtue. And as we've seen and continue to see in even recent whistleblower sort of cases, people often do face negative consequences sometimes for their actions. So Sarah's question is, would the ideal organization be one where speaking up wouldn't require moral courage?
Well,
the culture of institutions.
I think that would be an organization that would be very ideal. I mean, as an academic who spent 30 years, or more in a university history department, where you'd think freedom of expression is, if you can't have freedom of expression in a university, among a university faculty that are all in the same field. But even in those, I mean, I was department chair, so I've experienced about everything you can do in a department, but it sometimes takes courage to speak out there too, because if it's an unpopular thought, if it's something that you have colleagues that are not going to like. But I think academics are more willing. Maybe they don't have as much to risk. I don't know. I mean,
Philosophers.
Yeah, you're a philosophy department. I suppose you could comment on whether philosophers feel like they could always freely talk. Yeah, I think that would be ideal, and I certainly think it would be good when an organization has even some mechanisms in place to protect their whistleblowers. I mean, we have some whistleblower protections in our country now, but do they protect you well enough? I mean, in Al's case, I didn't mention this, but Congress, in fact, stepped in when it was learned, mostly through General Katina, that Al was being, sort of put on ice by Morton Thiokol in the immediate aftermath of his role in the Challenger investigation. Congress actually passed a resolution that if anything, nothing more should be done to Al. He needs to be put back in his job, and you need to leave him alone. I think the actual text of the resolution is in our book, but that's basically what happened, and that's a highly unusual thing to happen, to have someone, specifically an individual, as part of a congressional resolution to make sure that their company didn't penalize them in any way. But that happened with Al.
And I'm going to try to squeeze in at least two more questions.
Sure.
This one is from Catherine Bunn. And I think this is a good, something lurking in my own mind as well. So, do you think it makes sense to, who was ultimately responsible for the Challenger disaster? Should we think that Larry Malloy was responsible, William Lucas, Joe Kleinminster, or someone else, or no one?
I truly welcome that question, and I'll lay it on the line for you. This is something, it's in our book, but it's funny, Al never really emphasized it too much, and I'm not sure why, because he was certainly aware of it, and the Writers Commission didn't emphasize it either. But here it is. Morton Thiokol had a sole source contract with the government for the manufacture and delivery of solid rocket boosters. No other company was, so they had the monopoly on all of these SRBs. And this again was a time when, the shuttles were supposed to do everything in terms of getting American goods up into space. So they had control of that market. Well, in the months before Challenger, word was coming out that Thiokol management was hearing. I don't know, I have never traced the actual where the rumor mill was or what they were hearing, but NASA was interested in getting at least one more builder of SRBs so they could have competitive bidding with Morton Thiokol. So Thiokol wasn't the only supplier, so it wouldn't be a sole source contract anymore. It would be a competitive bidding thing. Well, if you're thought call management and you're in an environment where, we might lose some business to a competitor, NASA might be looking, it seems to be looking for another manufacturer of SRBs, you're going to do everything you can to make NASA happy with your operation. So I think if I had to say it was one thing, I would say it was corporate greed. I would say it was the greed of Thakal to try to control the market on the SRBs. And that if they had still had if they were not worried about losing a sole source contract, if they were still confident that they were the only ones that are going to do the SRBs, in a sense, NASA was over a barrel. I mean, they had to do what the Thakal would say. So if Thakal says we can't recommend a launch, I kind of think Thakal management wouldn't have overruled its own engineers if it hadn't had the profit motive and the fear that they were going to lose business. So that's, Al talks about that some, but he doesn't underline it as much as I would, and it's not that I'm against corporate profit motives or capitalism, but it's the way that, you do have to be worried about these sorts of things. And I'll say one other thing that sort of connects with this. We got to think about technology in 1980, 86, 87, that we have now that we didn't have then. What if we had cell phones, Zoom, all the other things we have today, if we had that stuff back in the 80s, if Al Mcdonald, if that teleconference had broken for a caucus, Al could have gotten on his cell phone, called Roger Beaujolais and say, what in the heck is happening there, Al? You're supposed to be gone for 5 minutes and it's been 30. And Al could say, well, the sons of the SOBs are telling us to take off our engineering hats and put on our management hats. What do you think of that? And I would say, well, don't do that. You don't do that. Put me on the speaker. One thing we have now with teleconferences is everybody would be seen, right? I mean, pretty much everybody would be seen. And I can just imagine what kind of body language Roger Beaujolais had when Kilminster and other top dogs came in and tried to tell them that, think like a manager, not like an engineer. They were probably close to bouncing off the walls in there, So if we had had that technology, and social media and everything else that we've got now back in the mid 80s, maybe the outcome would have been different. I don't know. Maybe not. If the corporate greed was so strong, maybe they would have still done it. But I think those are two factors, but certainly the corporate greed aspects of it and the sole source contract, to me, is absolutely essential. And I think, I don't know how many sole source contracts NASA has had since then. Hopefully none. Hopefully it's always been competitive bidding. But when you got one company that excels at doing one thing and it convinced the government that they're the best ones to do it, and there's nobody else saying they can compete. So to me, that's the biggest smoking gun, in my opinion.
So we have a couple more questions. I'm going to try to squeeze in a little bit more. This question is actually from Tim LeCain. So he writes, broadly, what do you think has changed from the amazing record of the earlier successes of NASA Apollo in the 1980s? What was the key to the earlier environment that produced excellence? Because, of course, even then there were private contractors that possibly had a profit motive.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did. In fact, I think when Al talked to me about the change from a can-do attitude to can't-do attitude, and the one example I gave him, especially when I learned more about the decision within NASA's mission management team for the shuttle not to approach the DoD to get this spy satellite turned around so we could get a good look at what actually damage was done on the Columbia. I mean, basically, there were things they could have done. They could have, if they had really known the extent of the damage and that this could cost the shuttle and the crew on the way back down, they could have tried to do a fix. They could have somehow had done EVAs and tried to fix it, or they could have sent maybe another orbiter up. I don't know how hard that would have been or the timing of it. They could have sent a rescue orbiter up. To me, it's a difference between, and I'm seeing this cinematically, Apollo 13, if you've even just seen the movie and not read about it, what happens there? You've got this very intense exploration by the people in Houston at Mission Control that are trying to figure out there's all kinds of jimmy rig things that they have to do to get those astronauts back. So there's a constant communication back and forth, and long list of things, you got to do this, now you got to do that. It was all figured out. There was this great team play because they were going to do everything they could to not lose that group, that mission and those 3 guys in that spacecraft. That, you juxtapose that with the decision by NASA mission management that not even to ask DOD for a picture of the damage. I mean, to me, that represents the extremes of the can do to the can't do. Why can't you do it? You don't want to ask. You don't want to upset Boeing because they have such faith in their supercomputer. I mean, why couldn't you do that? To me, you should have done everything. And I think to Al, you do everything you can to save that crew. And not even to tell them, not even to find out what damage there is and confront them with it and ask, what would you guys like to do? Would you like to try to fix it? How could we do that? So that to me, and maybe that is just a sort of a stultification of the bureaucracy that in a federal agency becomes. And maybe there are some insights from the Diane Vaughn book, the sociologist, that that can come into play here. But hopefully, I mean, one thing that the privatization of space is doing with Elon Musk and all the others that are moving to private space enterprises, maybe that's invigorating the can do. And I mean, risk taking is there. I mean, you've got to take some risks. I'm not suggesting for a moment, and Al certainly would not have, that there's any way to figure something out so well that you're never going to have accidents, or you're never going to have tragedies, you're never going to have catastrophes. They're going to come, and in a risky enterprise, and the public needs to be ready to adjust to that. But let's have it done in a truthful, honest way where we really can learn from it in the long run.
So I think that's actually, we have enough time for one more quick question. And I think the question by Ardeen is a really nice one to kind of end on. Ives, did you want to unmute yourself perhaps and ask your question?
Certainly. So my question, Dr. Hanson, is what do you think would happen to the space program had Alan McDonald signed the launch?
That's a really tough question. I consider it really counterfactual, because Al was not going to do it. What Al knew and what he did not know. I just can't imagine Al signing the recommendation ever. He wasn't going to do it.
But if he'd been there and the launch order had been signed,
and all he did do was deliver the facts to the NASA guys. And if he hadn't done it, it would have gotten to them one way or another, anyway.
I would have to say that that's a great way to end this, because this is all about Alan McDonald, and focusing on Alan McDonald is what's important here today, not on what ifs. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I hope to actually visit your campus and meet all of you at some point in the future. I'd love to see Montana again, and I'd love to have some chance to contribute to your studies in science, engineering, and ethics.
So thank you again to our speaker. And I just want to make 2 quick announcements. One is that if you know others that weren't able to attend live tonight, or if you have students that you think would benefit from this talk, it is being recorded and it will be posted tomorrow on the CSTEF's website, the same page where you entered from. If you entered into WebEx, it'll be posted there tomorrow. And also, I just want to invite people. We have another virtual event tomorrow at 2 p.m. where we'll be having a panel again with Dr. Hanson, and also with several MSU faculty who, in one way or another, are experts and or teaching engineering ethics in some way, shape, or form. So thank you again, and thanks for everyone for attending, and good night.